Please stand. My brothers and sisters, our good news has been recorded for us by Luke. That very day, the first day of the week, 2 of Jesus' disciples were going to a village 7 miles from Jerusalem called Emmaus. And they were conversing about all the things that had occurred. And it happened that while they were conversing and debating, Jesus himself drew near and walked with them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. Jesus asked them, "What are you discussing as you walk along?" They stopped, looking downcast. One of them, named Clopas, said to him in reply, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know of the things that have taken place these days?" He replied to them, "What sort of things?" They said to him, "The things that happened to Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and in word before God and all the people, how our chief priests and rulers both handed him over to a sentence of death and had him crucified. But we were hoping that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And beside all this, it is now the 3rd day since this took place. Some women from our group, however, have astounded us. They were at the tomb early in the morning. They did not find his body. They came back and reported that they had indeed seen a vision of a gospel passage." We could talk about how 2 disciples have already heard from the women that they had seen the tomb empty and that angels appeared to them and told them that Jesus was raised from the dead. They came back and they told them this. And in spite of all that, these 2 disciples end up leaving the others, heading off to Emmaus. We don't know what their intention was. We can't figure out exactly what the purpose of that trip was, except that maybe they were leaving everything. They were done. They were finished. Jesus was already crucified. He had died. They obviously don't believe that the women rose from, the women statement about Jesus rising from the dead. And so they figure all this is over. Let's go home. And so they walk away. What is interesting to me, again, another aspect that we could discuss here, is how even though these disciples struggle with their faith, sound like anyone familiar? It's me for sure. That even though they're struggling with their faith, Jesus goes out of his way to go after them, to pursue them, and to catch up with them and to engage in a conversation. To engage in a conversation so that they might better understand what has happened, what has been communicated to them, and the like. Also, additionally, another aspect about all this is how Jesus opens up the scriptures for them and reveals the hundreds of times that the Messiah is referred to in scripture and how it points to this person and all that has been fulfilled in Jesus, indeed crucified, died, and risen from the tomb. The one part I want to talk about a little bit today, though, has everything to do with discouragement and prayer. Because I think in a lot of ways, this is a prime example. When we're discouraged, it seems as though the last person we want to go to, because I'm not sure we're attuned to it. If we're hurting and in pain, I think we're more apt to go to God. But when we're simply discouraged, that level of discouragement leads us to a place where we're not really looking to God for God's support. We look to one another. And so these 2 are along the way, and they're talking about, and mind you, debating. It says debating about what has just taken place. So they have a difference of opinions, and they're discouraged at the outcome. And so the 2 are walking along, they're arguing, debating, discussing, and in the midst of that, God comes along, Jesus comes along and is present. And I want us to consider for a moment that in our own levels of discouragement, in our own troubles and challenges, in the things that we have difficulty believing in, love, hope, right? I mean, you and I wake up this morning to the Middle East being in the worst catastrophic situation and tensions that it has ever been, probably in its entire history. We went to bed one way, we woke up, and I don't know about you, but I feel an enormous sense of discouragement about that. Discouragement because it has led to this level. Discouragement that with everything we know about war and all that this world has experienced, that we still have not learned that war doesn't resolve anything, that there has to be other ways of doing this type of discussion. It can't be just simply power-led. And I am discouraged by the fact that leaders still choose, to choose weapons over words, choose weapons over peace, that there has to be some other way of coming up with a common ground and a common understanding. I am discouraged at humanity's sense or lack of sense about exactly where this all escalates to and how this all sort of plays itself out. I went to bed one way, and I woke up entirely different. This gospel passage has two people who are really discouraged because they believed and hoped one thing, and it turned out, or at least it appeared as though it wasn't going to turn out that way, and yet God pursues them in their discouragement. And so I know coming down, we were up in Poughkeepsie visiting Grandma, 94 years old. Happy birthday, Grandma. Grandma, 94 years old. We were up there, and I know driving down today, I was sort of saying to God, look, I feel terribly discouraged about all this, and I don't have a lot of controls over this. And I think the lack of control is something I probably struggle most with because my personal success in the businesses and whatnot that I'm involved in, the successes come about by the work of my hands or my direction. And in this regard, regrettably, I don't have any of that. And so you're sort of a victim. You just sort of sit here as a victim. If any of this resonates with you, you feel as though this is just what it is and there's nothing you could do. And so you just sort of wait it out. What I find hopeful in this passage for our situation is that in their discouragement, in their arguing, in their debating, it actually takes the form of a prayer. It takes a form of a prayer because they're looking for something greater than itself, and Jesus comes along. Jesus is drawn to the fact that they are discouraged, that they are debating, that they are arguing. And I know for us, we think prayer has to be a very simple, clear, pure, well-intentioned, structured type relationship with or communication with God. But here we have two individuals who are none of the above. These are not people that God would typically want to show up and sort of correct, because everything in their language indicates that they're going, and physically as well, they're moving in the wrong direction. And yet in their moving away and going away, and even in their thoughts and their words, this level of discouragement actually draws Jesus to them, draws Jesus to where they are, in spite of themselves. And this is one of those situations that I want us to reflect on, that our God does not work the way that you and I operate. You and I are much more critical and we're much more demanding of one another than I think the way God is. If Jesus, risen from the dead, on the very same day he rose from the dead, can go out of his way to find two people who are walking away, going the opposite direction, to catch up with them, and by the way, spend an entire day with them walking, and then also decide that he wants to spend the night. But notice what happens. They're discouraged. Jesus' words, Jesus' presence in their relationship, Jesus' response to their prayer brings them to say, would you stay with us? And it doesn't take him even a second to accept the invitation. And so often you and I are taught to believe that somehow something more is required of us than simply asking Jesus to be present. than simply asking him to be part of our life, to be part of this discouraging morning, in such a beautiful, gorgeous morning as we're having here in the Northeast. In spite of all that, there is huge discouragement, and we're all waiting with bated breath to see what happens next, to see what the country is possibly drawn into, what that region ends up looking like if things escalate. It's also terribly discouraging this morning that Jesus' command of love, indeed the Hebrew Scriptures' command of love, indeed the Muslims' language of compassion, is not in any way, shape, or form taken literally. It seems to be a nice, warm, fuzzy thing we apply when we want to apply it because it works out for our advantage. But in this entire region, this region where God has, made himself manifest, and these sacred writings and sacred scriptures speak to how we're meant to relate to one another, we're giving a very clear blueprint in all of this writing. We're given a very clear understanding in the Quran and in Hebrew scriptures and in Christian scriptures. We're given a very clear understanding of what it means to be compassionate. And that is meant to be to one another because God is first and foremost compassionate to us. And yet, as much as that is in the writings, when it comes to actions, we're not very quick as a human species to take it upon ourselves and to act that way. And so what has happened over the last couple hours and what is happening on TV right now? Everyone is making judgments. Everyone's drawing lines. Everyone's putting walls up about they're wrong, they're right, this shouldn't happen that way, that shouldn't happen that way. My point to all this is I think the scriptures, all sacred scripture, points to that word compassion. And if we're really, truly people of faith, then we must be living that which is written for us and presented to us as a dictate, as a model, as an example, as a diagram for how we live our lives. We simply cannot dismiss these things and pretend that it only works and we only talk about it when it's easy for us. These are the moments in time when we have to look at what it is, what does it mean to be Christian, and how do we work and live that experience now in the midst of our discouragement. And I believe if we're attentive this day, we will see moments in time where God comes and draws close to us, and God will correct us and direct us and guide us. And so I really believe this is a perfect example of prayer. There's no need to be perfect. We can be angry, we could be annoyed, we could be upset, we could be arguing, we could be debating, and in the midst of all that, it can still be done in such a way that we're not hating anyone else, we're just totally disillusioned and discouraged, and ultimately, I think that is the call. That is the call that draws Jesus to these disciples, and ultimately, after Jesus becomes present, their lives, their understanding, their vision of things changes, and they end up going forward. One last point. When the stranger, who we know now to be Jesus, approaches them, they had to make a choice to accept him walking with them along the road. They did not know who he was. They could have told him to shut up and move on. They could have. They could have dismissed him. They could have dismissed his presence. That same opportunity is available to us too. We can be open to it, but even when we experience it, we have a choice to either accept his presence and walk along with him and allow him to transform us, or we could simply say, what do you know? Go your own way. And I think every time we're discouraged, we have those moments where God becomes present in our life And our discouragement is a call of prayer. Jesus' response, but then ultimately, how do we respond to Jesus? God bless you.